Welcome to the Surgibots Podcast, powered by Cruxx.
I see also an awful lot of innovation coming in the form of AR. It's about giving the surgeon either the powers that they had when they were doing surgery manually, with the benefits of robotic surgery, but with the benefits brought back of both, basically, or so like a superhuman ability, the ability to see around the corner, to sense what they're touching, to know if they've got the whole thing. Those sorts of things are coming. There's increasing amounts of information being hoovered up by robots. It's one of the value propositions of a robot is that it sees a lot of stuff and it saves a lot of stuff. It's right in the center of the action. If you're going to say, I'm that rare that you need a robot in my place in order to have tele version of me, I just don't. But yeah, I have plenty of self-confidence. I think I'm good at what I do, but don't train a bloody robot.
Before we deep dive into this episode, I wanted to take 30 seconds to introduce you to the sponsors of this season of the podcast, TTP. TTP is a technical consultancy that has a 35-year track record helping companies transform innovative ideas into market-ready products. Their 300-strong team of scientists, engineers, and designers all under one move can take care of your surgical robotics or imaging technology from a napkin sketch all the way through to early stage commercialization. I was lucky enough to get the invite out to their Cambridge facility. They gave me eyes on a number of the projects they're working on, and not only is the facility state of the art, but the main competitive advantage I see with these guys is their people. A group of incredibly smart, focused and friendly guys who do not shy away from a lofty engineering challenge. If you want to learn more about some of the work they've done or to talk more about a project you have in mind, shoot me a message on LinkedIn or visit their website, ttp.com, to get in touch with one of the team. Hello, Paul, and welcome to the Surgibots Podcast.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to host you. So to start off with, what I want to do is deep dive into your background. So can you talk me through your university days and then moving into the industry?
Sure. So, yeah, studied in engineering in Cambridge and went into a PhD in robotics, but not surgical robotics. I was actually studying the physics of the violin, and I built a simulation model of the violin and then a robot to play the cello in order to validate the simulation model. And I always thought that was an extremely esoteric academic discipline. But I have to say, I don't want to sort of spoiler alert, but yeah, I fast forwarded 20 years later and I was seeing that, oh my gosh, the feedback control system that I developed for my robot's the exact same as they use in a surgical robot. So, okay, so there's some transferring, Anyway, but from a PhD in the physics of the violin, I went into product development and I was in all sorts of different technology areas such as leaf blowers, razors for shaving, inkjet printing. And actually, inkjet printing was really interesting. Inkjet printing was a real highlight for me because it had all these piezos and physics problems and engineering problems and manufacturing problems. And what I found was that I got deeper and deeper into inkjet printing. And then one day, literally the CEO of TTP and I were talking, and we'd each sort of convinced each other ourselves that if you take a whole bunch of piezos on an inkjet print head and you turn it upside down and stick it in water, it becomes an ultrasound imaging device. And we said, well, should we give it a try? We've got the perfect inkjet heads that we develop, and they could be ultrasound imaging devices. So we tried it, we got a pulse echo, and ultimately thereafter we got an image, and we thought, gosh, so now we're in ultrasound imaging. Okay. And from ultrasound imaging, we went into other things like navigation and even augmented reality and sensing on an instrument and sensing on a tool. And that got us into then surgical robotics. And it was literally in 2016, we were quite late to the party in surgical robotics. We sort of got in with a roar, but quite late. And we were literally just preparing to meet with a surgical robotics company. We thought, oh, good Lord, this is a really big area. We need to really take this seriously. So one thing led to another, and we ended up getting deeper and deeper into surgical robotics. We ended up working on all sorts of different robots, from heart robots to colon robots to laparoscopic robots and orthopedic robots. And so, yeah, that's kind of my journey. I've been working on all of those things for all like 21 years at TTP now. So starting in inkjet printing and getting into surgical robotics in the end.
Excellent. So before you realised that inkjet printers were ultrasound scanners, what was TTP before that? What were you guys working on, and was that the first foray into medtech?
It wasn't the first foray into medtech, but it very much widened our foray into medtech. So yeah, TTP is actually like 36, 37 years old. And TTP is a product development company, technology development company. We've always been that. I'd say 21 years ago when I joined, it was still a fairly geeky, sort of confident geeks culture. And then after a few years, it started to get a little bit more sort of sharp-minded, geeky culture. And through that period of time, our medtech work, I guess on the periphery, that was a lot of drug delivery devices. So we're very familiar with medical device regulations and such like, but weren't doing so many. We're doing some surgical tools like a hip rasp, laparoscopic tools, those sorts of things, but nothing too complex mechatronic like 25 years ago, at least that I can remember. So yeah, I guess this kind of journey took TTP's medtech activity from occasional to quite recognized and quite deep and actually quite high tech. So nowadays what we tend to say is in medtech terms, we tend to do high tech projects. So if you've got something which is, to be honest, which is super easy, we're too expensive for it. If you've got something which is super complex, it's perfect for us. And that's kind of where we hang out.
Excellent. So let's talk more about TTP then. So you've given us quite a high level overview, but let's go into a bit more detail. So what can TTP actually do for a surgical robotics company or emerging medtech company?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So for a surgical robotics company, we're doing typically one of a few things. It can be absolutely that core design of complex electromechanical fly-by-wire engineering design, starting from human factors and understanding the need and researching the clinical use case of reimbursement models and so on, through to a concept and a prototype and into product engineering. It can be that core business of product development for that robot. Sometimes also it can be enabling the next generation of that robot. So for example, if you just look at today's Da Vinci 5, it's got haptic feedback, and it's just a good example of a robot trying to give back to the surgeon something which they'd lost as a result of having a robot. So you lose that sense of touch and feel. And there's other things as well, like, for example, what about being able to see through the tissue that you're about to touch? What about being able to tell what it is you're touching? What about it's perfused? What about there's some infection lurking here? A chemical sensor of that kind. And also, what about being able to see around a corner? So that might sound a little bit more esoteric, but no, it's absolutely doable. So if you have a couple of cameras and one of them's obscured, the other one patches in for the other one, mapped onto the other camera, so you can kind of see around a corner, if you like. Those sorts of things give back a feeling of control and feel. Oftentimes we're helping with things like critical structure identification or margin evaluation, or we're reducing the cognitive burden by putting more information on a head-mounted display. And actually, in some cases, what we're working increasingly on as well is actually, have to say, displacing surgical robotics entirely and moving into augmented reality. So instead of having a fly-by-wire system where you're here and then there's a robot that has end effectors, that actually you're working on the robot, but it's guiding you to what you need to do with an augmented reality display. So that's another area for us to be working. So as I say, sometimes it's the core engineering of a robot. Usually, honestly, it's when it's a really complex new robot. It's not. We're not developing Intuitive's Da Vinci 6. I'm afraid, but. Yeah, so sometimes it's that core engineering, and sometimes it's something really interesting to differentiate that next generation of robot. Like instead of sticking actually, I'll pause there. I nearly strayed into something confidential.
Okay, no worries at all, no worries. So, because you work with quite a few different surgical robotics companies and you get a good overview of the whole landscape in lots of different surgical specialties, I wanted this episode to really be a bit of a lesson almost, or like how to develop a surgical robot and not fall into some of the pitfalls. So what do you see as the big things that surgical robotics companies get wrong, and why do you think so many companies have failed up to this point?
There's a whole bunch of reasons. I've seen, I'm just the engineer. As you say, I do see a lot of stuff, and it gives me opinions, but I'm not saying I'm right, so caveat out of the way. Things like, for example, I'm invested in my tech, and it's the thing that I'm doing, and if it's wrong, I have to close the company. It's kind of like an investment, a sort of gambler's fallacy, if you like, where it must be worth a lot because it took me a lot of effort to create it. No, your baby's ugly. It's not a good robot. I wish I could name names. I shouldn't name names. I was literally talking to a company yesterday who's buying one of them, and I just thought, no, it's so bad. Don't. It's just not going to compete in the market. You're not going to go up against Intuitive with that thing. It's just not going to win. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why people fail. And, another one is what's the need? What's the value proposition? I'll give an example. In structural heart, that's an application. I think that's a great application for surgical robotics. You've got the need to carefully position a heart valve, and ideally you're going to do that through a catheter. So transcatheter heart valve replacement or transaortic valve replacement is a great application. It's a very untapped market, and it's really difficult. Really difficult because there's too many degrees of freedom. It's a classic reason why you want a surgical robot. That's great. And I hate to say it, but you get a lot of people who are developing robots without that clear need, without that value proposition. And it might be that they're serving an esoteric segment of Intuitive's market, and they will try to capture a piece of Intuitive's market by going up against a company in the form of Intuitive is far more mature, far more. And then frankly, let's say you've got a really rounded, I fear for companies like CMR going up against Intuitive, because Intuitive has a really mature sales and distribution network, financial clout. They can go up to the CFO of a hospital and say, we will place this robot at a cost that suits you in order to secure the downstream revenues. It's just a juggernaut. And so there's so many reasons. I just think sort of finance genuinely serving an actual need in the market is another. And I have seen CEOs of companies preach about we have to understand the need and make sure that we've got a good value proposition. And yet I look at their robot and I think, that didn't sound good. That looks bad. Like, okay, maybe you could use that in this one niche application, and maybe somebody will give you a grant to do that. But that doesn't, it just completely just sounds bad. And they go out of business. I hate to say, and again, I'm just an engineer. I couldn't do it any better. I'm not a CEO of a company, but there's all sorts of reasons.
For sure. So I want to dive into that intuitive subject. So soft tissue surgical robotics is dominated by Intuitive, and people are trying to go up against them. Medtronic, CMR are probably the only two who have realistically commercialized a soft tissue surgical robot to actually try and compete. But competition is healthy, and having one big monopoly in any industry is not healthy for that industry. So what are the chinks in Intuitive's armor, and where can people compete with Intuitive? Where do you see if any opportunities where people can go at them, and where do you think their weakness lies? If there is any.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, people talk about Intuitive as being a large, non-maneuverable, non-modular, gantry, which is stubbornly clinging on to its form factor. But, I mean, let's just say that leaves room for other entrants. So if you think of the video game industry, for example, you think of Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. You've got three good gaming platforms, and I think the reason they can support three is because Nintendo go after more of a family feel, and leaving Sony and Microsoft to go after the more sort of the traditional gaming market. In surgical robotics, I know it's more complex. There's many more indications, but within soft tissue, within laparoscopic surgery, and actually, interestingly, maybe we should talk about other applications for Intuitive, but for soft tissue surgery, laparoscopic surgery rather, there are an awful lot of other form factors which there's good reasons why there might be room for a few others. So that maybe there's room for 4 or 5. And if you include single port and multi-port, there are applications which are suited to one and suited to the other. So maybe that's another. But yeah, Intuitive's in both of those spaces. But if you just think of also geography, so geography, China made a robot for China. There's a huge value for that. There's a huge market for that. Like Lenovo should do very well, for instance, and all the other Chinese robots. I do worry about companies like Vicarious, where they're going after more of a niche area of laparoscopy, and I just worry that their whole value proposition is quite fragile. It might come together, but it's so that kind of thing I'm quite concerned about. They're trying to get a critical mass. They're trying to raise enough money and do enough work in order to get into the market in a niche of laparoscopy. Sort of ventral hernias, those sorts of applications. And I don't know about that, but I could see that, the likes of Medtronic and J&J certainly have the legs. They've got the assets to put onto their robots. It's not so much about the perfect robot, it's also about the portfolio that comes with it, the terrific stapling and ligature and graspers and suturing, and those sorts of things are terrific portfolio plays for J&J and Medtronic. I realize J&J is under a whole lot of pressure because they're late to the market, but still I could see them competing quite effectively. I could see CMR as well, but it's hard to see outside of countries like China. It's hard to see too many more. So I'd go for something like 4 or 5 in the market, but not 10, not 15. And then where do you put something like Moon Surgical? Well, we'll have to see. I wish I could give you an opinion. I'm just curious about Moon. So maybe there's other sort of adjacencies like Moon Surgical. The other adjacency is really interesting. Outside of laparoscopy is companion robotics. So combined endoscopic, laparoscopic robotics. If you've got something like a Nissen from duplication and you want to have something inside and something inside the organ, something inside the sort of the GI tract and a laparoscopic piece, and they can work together. That's quite a compelling thing. Or if you're doing colectomy or you're working on a very sessile polyp in the colon, and you want to work on it from inside the colon, so it's a tissue-sparing procedure like an endoscopic submucosal dissection procedure, but there's involved lymph nodes, and those could be dissected out laparoscopically. You could do those in one anesthetic event with the combined approach of an an advanced endoscopic surgery system and a laparoscopic system. So I could see good arguments for augmenting it in that way. I think that makes it harder if you're doing just endoscopic or endoluminal robotics. It gives you an advantage if you have access to both, like EndoQuest, for example. But yeah, and I'd imagine that Intuitive will be thinking, how can we go from ion and into colon surgery or other, not just colon, I realize endoluminal is huge, but let's say colon, together with the Da Vinci, and that's quite a compelling, powerful. So, okay, back to Intuitive again, but I could see room for competition outside of pure laparoscopy as well.
Okay, excellent. So you started to touch on Chinese robots and emerging Asia. So why do you think that's such a compelling market, having a Chinese robot for China? Why do you think that is?
A Chinese robot for the China. So, my understanding is that there's an awful lot of red tape if you want to have a non-Chinese robot used in China. And so there's financial incentives all over the place for Chinese developed robots in China. And there's also simply bureaucracy and admin overheads to get non-Chinese robots. That's my understanding, and I just keep hearing it over. And I admit I've never tried to get into China with a robot, but that's just what I keep hearing is a major obstacle for the likes of, say, Ascensus or Medtronic, or, I can imagine it's going to be harder for them to get into China.
Okay. Cool. So with these more mature systems that are out on the market across the board, really, it doesn't have to just be in soft tissue. How do these companies evolve and how do they move forward? What's the future technologies that we're going to see, and how or where do you think the competitive advantages lie moving forward?
So what's around the corner? I think what's the new technologies that we'll see are likely to be the things that take away the difficulties of surgical robotics today. So, for example, the setup time, or, for example, the lack of feel, or the inability to distinguish what one organ from another organ. So critical structure identification. Can I see the ureter in laparoscopic surgery? Can I tell the margins of this tumor? Have I got the whole tumor out? And it's also things, really simple things like integration, close integration into a tower of an ultrasound imaging system, or even close integration of an ultrasound imaging system into a grasper. So just go back to laparoscopy. If you had a grasper like my hand, and you could turn it over and have a look at with your wrist onto the organ and say, oh, I see what's inside. That's really well integrated. That comes with all sorts of problems and difficulties, like the number of cables that you have to put through the grasper. Most laparoscopic robot companies would say, I don't want to touch that with a barge pole. But actually, there are ways to get around that challenge, to have fewer cables coming out, to have a grasper, an ultrasound tool, and like 6 cables coming through the trunk, the wrist of the laparoscopic grasper. So things like that are super innovative. I see also an awful lot of innovation coming in the form of AR. I'm being careful not to say AI. AI is a sort of another story we'll get to in another time, but AR is really interesting. So I'd like to be able to call up the preoperative scan. I'd like to be able to see what the liver looked like in the CT scan before this procedure, so that I can plan and I have a look at the preoperative plan. And actually, okay, I'd also like to see how it would be updated now that I've moved things around. So things like that coming into a head-mounted display or an immersive display. I think those are coming. Those might be 5 years away. It's not 1 year away, but they're coming. And there's signs of them in the market already. You know, Iris, for example, is a step towards that. You know, what else is there? There's also things like, what type of tissue am I touching? Now, you might say, I can tell what I'm touching, but I mean, what's slightly beneath the surface? Is the lymph node there? Is the cancerous lymph node there? Is that the one? So, for example, right now, there's a lot of surgery to remove sentinel lymph nodes, where you literally do scintillator scan, and you mark on the skin where you, literally with a marker where you saw the lymph node. And wouldn't it be exciting if you could actually still see it in the procedure? Instead of doing the SPECT CT before the procedure, you could actually see it in the procedure. Now that is coming. That will come. It's difficult to explain. It's kind of a long story, but that's coming. So things like, what type of tissue am I touching? You know, the screen just changed color. It's telling me that I've found the nerve now, or I'm too close to the nerve now. So things like that. Critical structure identification is huge, and that's coming. Everybody's talking about perfusion. I think you know more about that, but you know, perfusion imaging, different forms of perfusion imaging. Another thing is also in fluorescence imaging. So today, fluorescence is really dominated by, obviously, indocyanine green ICG imaging, which shows where blood vessels are. But there's a lot of good work in the academic realms, and it's creeping into industry, like obviously confidential things, but without the ICG, with different dyes. And one of the interesting things about different dyes is they have different wavelengths. Your ICG camera has the wrong wavelength sensitivity, so it wouldn't be able to see necessarily with the right contrast. So adjusting the optics on the camera. And another thing is also, one of the most adventurous and interesting things is to be able to distinguish, just like you do with ICG, but with autofluorescence, lifetime. So this is a new contrast mechanism to distinguish different organs or different anatomies or different disease states, with the benefit of the lifetime of the fluorescence emitted by the organ's own autofluorescence. Now, I think I could be a bit more scientific about how I put that, but I hope that makes a bit of sense. It's basically a new contrast mechanism. There's all sorts of things. So also, what about seeing... Anyway, there's a lot of stuff. Basically, it's about giving the surgeon either the powers that they had when they were doing surgery manually, with the benefits of robotic surgery, but with the benefits brought back of both, basically, or so like a superhuman ability, the ability to see around the corner, to sense what they're touching, to know if they've got the whole thing. Those sorts of things are coming.
Yeah. And I mean, it's all super interesting stuff. What my question would be to that is like, how much does that move the dial in terms of clinical outcomes and clinical things getting better? Because sometimes it's technology for the sake of technology. Some of the times it sounds really exciting, but in reality, it doesn't actually convert into clinical outcomes. So, how much do you think these things can move the dial?
Well, I love that question because it kind of relates to something you were asking about earlier, which is one of the pitfalls. Yeah, there's a lot of people who get hung up on the tech, and I completely agree. I'm guilty as charged. I can get too excited about some tech, and then you end up too invested in it, and it's the thing, and you can't get away from it. So I totally agree with you, but there are some huge clinical benefits in some of these areas. So, for example, tissue-sparing procedures. If I have endoluminal capabilities inside the colon, if I have an ESD capability, that means that I can remove that difficult polyp without a full colectomy. That means the patient doesn't have to go home with today a GI surgeon will want to, if you get referred for surgery in your colon, they remove a colectomy, they remove a piece of your colon, they anastomose it back together, and they often send you home with a colostomy bag and an awful lot of trauma, physical trauma. So if you can actually have a surgical approach, let's say near the, even around the cecum, all the way around to the cecum, and you can actually remove cancer without removing a big chunk of colon, that patient can go home the same day as if they just had a colonoscopy. I mean, that's a huge difference. There's no colostomy bag. There's no months of recovery. It's a huge difference. And actually, some people just can't withstand a more traumatic surgery. They just can't. They're not eligible for it. It's too invasive. It's too traumatic. So they just can't. But they could maybe tolerate a more delicate surgery like that. So that's one really, really obvious example. It's just purely endoluminal robotics. It needs to get further into the market. It needs to get into the market to get to realize some of these huge clinical benefits. Another example, we're talking about margin detection or critical structure identification. Margin detection, if you had that capability, let's say you had an electrical impedance capability on your grasper and you put it down, it's not quite ultrasound, it's not quite the fidelity of ultrasound, but you could see there's still some vasculature here, or there's some cancer left. Well, I cut a bit more and then I'm done. Or I don't have to cut as much in order to be careful. So I've saved tissue, and the patient benefits from either A, not having to be re-intervened because the cancer is still there, or B, having more of their liver left or more of their whatever, their organ left. So that's another one. And nerves. If you cut a nerve, you can lead to really serious complications. If you can avoid the nerve, then you don't. I have a friend who went in for a standard gynae procedure, but their ureter got nicked, and as a result, they had months of recovery. So avoiding that would be good for my friend. Hate to say it, but there's all sorts of clinical benefits to these things. And then there's others like ergonomics. Dare we talk about ergonomics? So the world of orthopedic surgery is limited by the lifetime of the orthopedic surgeon. You're taking a mallet and you're striking. You're striking from up here, and you're tiring out all your body. You're contorting yourself like this. You might design a surgical tool in the form of a gun, but actually it's held up like that. So you either contort your wrist, or there's ergonomic benefits which literally prolong the lifetime of a surgeon. So I've heard, for example, that in endoscopic submucosal dissection, today's practitioners can only work about a half a day at a time. I think in Japan they push for more, but generally speaking, there's a huge benefit in having ergonomic improvements. What about setup time? Quicker to set up. You don't have to go back and forth between two rooms. You don't have to drape so many things. You don't have to. Reducing trauma in robotic surgery, reducing setup time. If I can get 5 done in a day instead of 4, well, that's another patient. There's an economic benefit, but there's a clinical benefit as well. So, and then we talk about telesurgery. Oh my God, that's the one I'm on the fence about. If I'm honest, absolutely honest, telesurgery for stroke. Everybody's talking about it. And this scarcity of interventional neurophysiologists for stroke treatment. I hear it over and over and over. China's going crazy about it. America's got, 5 or something robots in them? I don't know how many, but it's got a whole ton of stroke robots, some of which are public. So there you go. And it's all about bringing expertise from a central hospital, the hub and spoke model. Is there a clinical advantage? You're asking, is there a clinical advantage in that? I hope so. I really hope so. And I've been wrong before. I was wrong in this field before. I'm skeptical, and I really want to be proved wrong because I can see the investment going into it. I can see the model where you have this, the centralized expert who's too scarce to recruit into every other hospital, and stroke is super time critical. So you get them quickly operating a rural hospital's robot, and that rural hospital's patient benefits from the expertise. I just keep thinking, you're going to spend that much money on a robot, you have to invest in a neuro ICU, and that you can't put money into the system to train more interventional neurophysiology. I don't know. I'm sometimes a bit skeptical there. I have to confess, I'm really desperately hoping to be proven wrong on that one, as I have before. So anyway, I don't know, complex answer, but generally yes.
I'm interrupting today's episode to bring you a word about one of our sponsors, Fundamental VR. If you go back to season 1, you'll find a great episode with Richard Vincent, CEO of Fundamental, on all the reasons why training in the virtual world can shorten the learning curve and reduce training burden and costs. Improve competency at scale with interactive digital twins of your surgical robot or medical device in a high-fidelity virtual environment. Drive commercial success with Fundamental VR's virtual reality solutions.
So there's a couple of points that came up there. So there's a quote from one of my friends in the space, a guy called Vishwa, COO at SS Innovations, who said that telesurgery is not about creating the mega godlike omnipresent surgeon who's just everywhere doing surgeries all around the world. It's not about that. It's about the teleproctoring and sharing the knowledge and bringing the world up and training, and that's where he sees it. But I do want to deep dive into the neurovascular side of things because I'm just a recruiter at the end of the day, and I'm wrong about a lot of things in this space because I get lots of knowledge from all over the place, but I've quite a lot of the time seen a big use case for the neurovascular interventions in the rural locations. So I want to deep dive into why more specifically you think that it's maybe not going to be as good as people are saying.
Yeah, I went to a conference in Sages this year, and I said to a clinician who was a proctor for a robot, I said, look, I'm just an engineer, but I've got some questions for you. And he said to me, Paul, he was this really well-respected KOL, and he said to me, Paul, never say just an engineer. I hear you. You're saying you're just a recruiter. You're exposed to all sorts of things. You're a very bright guy. I don't think that's a bad question. I think it's a terrific question. I don't think you're just a recruiter. I think you're a terrific recruiter. So you want to talk about the neurovascular robotics, is that right? And
I want to
why
talk about
they might
neurovascular,
succeed and fail?
Yeah, please.
Well, I mean, again, I'm openly skeptical, but openly suspicious of my own skepticism. So lightly held skepticism, shall we say. And then the answer is economic. So I'm seeing the cost of a robot being born. The proposition seems to me, look, you need to get an expert on in this field and they'll shoot me down very quickly. But my observation is that you're proposing to put hundreds of thousands of dollars of hospitals' cash into a robot, and $1 million of cash into an ICU, neuro intensive care unit, and all sorts of infrastructure around that whole stroke treatment center. And the whole reason for the robot, the value proposition, is that it's then driven by a specialist neurointerventional physiologist from central Memphis or New York City or whatever, and they're not out in the boondocks because they can't afford them. You're going to spend $1 million on all that stuff, and the system can't afford to have whatever the cost is to train. And I get it. You have an interventional neurophysiologist is a niche of a niche, and in medicine that's increasingly rare. I understand that, but I just keep thinking, let's say you were going to propose to replace me with a robot. just train more people like me. I'm not that difficult to train. You know what I mean? It's like if you're going to say I'm that rare that you need a robot in my place in order to have tele version of me, I just don't. Yeah, I have plenty of self-confidence. I think I'm good at what I do, but don't train a bloody robot. Just invest more in academia. That's my. And it's a very simple argument, and I'm not saying I'm right because there's so many people who know better than me who are investing in it. But that's my skepticism, and I'm looking forward to the market penetration of all the Corinduses and all the catheter robotics out there in the world, and China's got a whole zillion of them. So
yeah,
I think it's coming. And the other thing I've seen, actually, I have to say, and a caveat is, I confess I was a little skeptical about lung robotics. When I thought, no, you can learn bronchoscopy. It's not that. Okay, admittedly, when I tried bronchoscopy, I absolutely failed hopelessly and terribly and badly, I admit. So I should have maybe watched my own ineptitude. But I thought, no, surely what you need is this and you need this. And then robotics, curiosity. If you got a lot of cash, you can. But I'm starting to see actually clinicians just expect it. It's just kind of like a basic expectation. I've tried Ion. That's what I'm going to be using. I'm not going to do my 30 procedures to train to get okay at it. I'm going to just have an Ion. And it just takes me a couple procedures and it's easy. It's actually genuinely, anybody could do it. So that's a very different value proposition. But my point is that I've been wrong many times. And that was one where I was a little skeptical. I thought, I'm not sure Monarch's going to get into the market and do that well. I was looking at Monarch and I thought, I'm not sure I buy the value proposition. And I was wrong. So there you go.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, we can all be wrong on occasion. So, yeah, I think with the neurovascular side, there's I like the remote stroke treatment because it can get into the patients of people who can't actually get access to the surgery. So I like the use case. I completely get the economics. One idea I have heard is that people could drive around in a sort of mobile robot where you only need the person to drive the van and then someone is sat in a big hospital centre and they can drive the robot from that central place, and it depends on the robot. Not all the robots are going to be able to do it like some of these big ones where you have to have big architectural changes in the hospitals, but if you can get that on the road and driving to the patient when the stroke happens, that could be a big area where there could be an advantage and get more economics out of it because going to each of the locations in a day. But it's an interesting one anyway. Robots are obviously expensive, so economics is a big place where they do have to work out, but they're only going to get cheaper hopefully in the long run.
Well, look, I mean, two comments on that. First of all, stroke is a huge importance to mankind. Stroke kills and it destroys lives and it ruins families. It needs what we can do. What we can do for stroke is a good thing to do for stroke. And if the economics works out, that's terrific. It's a good application. There's nothing. There's nothing superfluous about stroke treatment. The second comment I've got is, you're talking about ambulatory care, and I know you're not talking about ambulatory service centers, the sort of the remote, but there is another big drive in surgical robotics to make them small, and to be able to put them into smaller ambulatory centers which don't have the space, frankly, don't have the infrastructure to cope with a lot. And so, for example, in orthopedics, you're seeing a big drive to go from big box robots to small handheld robots. There's a trend. The likes of Think Surgical, the likes of Corin, the likes of actually Core E as well. I mean, I agree with you. Ambulatory care is an increasing drive. I know it's not quite the same point you're making, but stroke's worth treating. Robots need to get smaller, will get smaller. Use cases will change and evolve. We're talking about, you and I are here talking about things over the next 5 years, 3 years. Imagine 50 years from now. 50 years from now, it's all completely different. And maybe some of these investments are building blocks towards a completely different future in 50 years' time. AI is going to, we should at some point talk about AI, but anyway, but yeah, I'm just saying it. Some of these things are trends and drivers in that direction that we certainly see. Yeah, I'm just an engineer, but I certainly see these things left, right, and center all the time.
Absolutely, and I think when you're talking about that longer term versus now is There's that very famous quote, which I'm sure everyone's heard, is people overestimate what can be done in a year, but in 10 years underestimate it. I think that's what we're thinking, like, especially in the AI field. So we are going to dive into that AI topic. So where is AI coming to surgical robotics? We can talk more generally about medtech as well, because I think it's important not to just focus on the robots here. But yeah, let's talk about AI. Where do you see the big opportunities? Where is it just a buzzword that's being stuck on a pitch deck? And where is it actually going to get good use out of artificial intelligence?
Yeah. So first of all, AI means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But if we just use the very broad definition of it, right now there's increasing amounts of information being hoovered up by robots. It's one of the value propositions of a robot is that it sees a lot of stuff and it saves a lot of stuff. It's right in the center of the action. It can tell you that this medical center is doing these types of surgeries, and in phase 3 of the procedure, they're always very slow. Therefore, I could sell them something different, or therefore we can improve their standard of care. So that there's a lot of value there, and that's not the most glamorous, it's not the most exciting, but that's today. That's in the market. So the black box data recorder use of AI is growing. So you know what I mean. You've got something in the center of the OR. It's at this point part of a robot. It doesn't have to be part of the robot. By the way, my sister once said to me, she's a violinist, and she said to me, "Paul, you're talking about all this stuff on surgical robotics. All this stuff also applies to normal surgical tools, doesn't it? Couldn't you put all this stuff onto a normal surgical tool?" I was like, yes, good point. It doesn't need to be a robot. But anyway, we can come back to that another time. But yeah, AI today is definitely hoovering up information and telling you very valuable things about your surgery of today, your hospitals, the performance of the robot. There's all sorts of things. But I mean, if you think about what's just entering the market and just sort of in the market but not that well penetrated yet, is things like diagnostics. So you'd think of, for example, in colonoscopy, AI is telling you, "Oh, I just spotted a polyp; it was there." That sort of thing is quite well established, and I think it'll get better and it'll keep getting more accurate and more and so forth. But there's also slight adjacencies that the next step along is, did I cover the whole colon? If I did my colonoscopy, did I miss a bit? So you sort of piece together the entire three-dimensional surface of the colon, and there are a few shadows behind folds systematically on the reverse ascending that bit. You missed a bit there, and there, so you better go back and take a look. And you go there and you finish the job. So things like that are just coming into the market. But if you just fast forward, I think I heard that AI is able to pass an IQ test of about and get a score of like 150, 160 right now. And if you fast forward to 10 years from now, that it might be a IQ of 300, 400. I don't know. I'm just saying it should be more intelligent than a human. So if you think about how fast it's changing, and then you think about how intelligent and capable it is of understanding what it's seeing. Yes, you have to train it, but people have to be trained. So I don't want to get too deeply into autonomous robotics because it just tends to get people too sci-fi like. But AI making intelligent diagnostics now and tomorrow, and AI actually driving surgical robots, it's coming. I mean, it will come. There's only so many decades that the human will be the best choice to figure out how to do a cholecystectomy procedure on that patient and then execute it.
Autonomous surgery is it does sound sci-fi, but there's a number of companies that we work with that are working towards it today and showing actually that technically a lot of it can actually be done already. The technical piece is not necessarily the hardest part about it. It's the regulatory piece, it's the training of the AI models to make sure and being able to actually prove that it's safe. So it is coming. There's people working on the solutions and people demonstrating that it's actually possible. I do think it's how far away do you think it actually is? Because we've obviously got these challenges, 2 of them I just mentioned. How far away do you think it is before the market's ready? Because I mean, so there's actually a company who's been incubated for about 10 years we know of, who have been working on this for 10 years, but you don't come to market until the technology is ready because the market's not ready for it. But yeah, next 5, like, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 15 years? When do you think the market's going to be mature enough for actually autonomous surgery?
So good question. Like it's not as, I think, to sort of dive into the regulations part, it's not just that regulations are really difficult. It's actually, it's the risk. To eliminate risks is what you're looking for. So to eliminate risks in some applications is actually not too difficult. For example, to transplant hair follicles, you can say that the worst that could happen is not the end of the world. You don't have the power to do too much damage, and it's a very well-validated robot, so therefore it's safe. And that's much nearer term. I think, would it be commercial? I think it would be highly commercial. So I think that, as you put it, the regulations or the risk reduction of the regulations, I think that's absolutely where the challenge is. Commercially, you're talking about reducing the labor costs in a procedure, which is an enormous financial benefit. And frankly, is it sellable? Oh my gosh. I would imagine that the public would be extremely keen on a purely robotic procedure. So that robot is going to do the procedure. I don't have to worry about a human making a mistake. Oh, fantastic. So I don't know. I mean, if it's, and I'd say that's a stronger pitch than getting in a Waymo, which doesn't have a driver. That's kind of more of a novelty. And you're thinking, actually, this is an immediate death trap, which could just drive into that thing. And that's catching on, So if that can catch on, and you're thinking, well, if I want the best quality of care for my cholecystectomy or my acetabular, I don't know, take your pick of a procedure, then I'd love to have it done robotically, because a robot's going to be precise, and the public like that word of precision. I'm going to have a more precise procedure because it's robotic. I think that'd be very commercial. I don't know. I mean, heck, then again, if it takes $50 billion to develop it, then it's not very commercial anymore. But
no.
but yeah, also, I think it's highly commercial.
Also, with the Cruxx example, as it might crash into a tree, well, the surgical robot may crash into a very critical artery and then not know what it's doing. So I don't know how the public. I mean, I'm involved with the space, and a lot of the time, I think I would definitely go robotic if the opportunity was there. But then I've been around surgical robots. I've test driven them. I've spoken to people who they sell the benefits of it. So I would do it, but then other people, I'm sure, would be more skeptical. So yeah, it's
if I might. So you're talking about the skepticism. Take a look at the vision system of the Ascensus robot. Now, I'm not here trying to advocate Ascensus or Carl Storz. If this recording goes out by the time that deal is closed, Carl Storz, but Ascensus with their vision system, you geotag things, and it rings. Okay, they haven't added all the functionality that they can yet, but the crux of a vision system is more apparent. If you sit and drive an Ascensus robot, some would say it's a gimmick, but if you just think, look at how it's able to keep track of the location of that bit of tissue. It's not that much of a leap to think it now needs to figure out which bit of tissue the surgeon wanted to tag, and then you have the guts of a closed loop. So I'm just saying it. I can see a lot of confidence being built in this area. I don't think it's a big leap. I don't think it's more than 10 years away.
Very good, very good. So I'm gonna spend the last part of this podcast just talking more about TTP and what you guys do, because we've done a lot of talk about surgical robotics, about the market. We briefly touched on TTP earlier in the conversation, but I think it's really important to kind of tell the story of TTP and some of the work that you've done. So can you give me a bit of information about like the way you guys work, how you get involved with companies, and how you can support companies in this ecosystem? Because I think after people have heard this conversation, there's going to be quite a lot of interest in what you guys do.
Sure. So there's some things that we do that we claim to do, and there are other things that we never advertise that people get us doing because they see that we can help in that area. But so we develop products. So if you want to go to market quickly, you need deep expertise. You want so basically the three reasons why TTP is turned to are technical depth, speed to market, and actually organizational flexibility. So those are the three areas. And in terms of technical depth, it's we sort of hang a not an albatross. We hang a heavy weight around our necks by setting recruitment standards very high. And that sounds arrogant, but we do, and it really makes recruitment a real pain in the neck. That's why we're hoping to work more with you, Henry. But yeah, recruitment and having the highest standard of person. And then also we invest in building assets. So for example, in endoluminal robotics, we built up a system to tell ourselves where the challenges are. And now we know if you want to build an endoluminal instrument, which has 6 degrees of freedom, then here's where the hysteresis kicks in, and there's where the feedback control system is going to be enabled, and those sorts of things. So we tend to have that technical depth in surgical robotics and also some technology assets that can be deployed. For example, in ultrasound imaging, for example, in elastography. So if you want to see where's the stiff part of the breast or where is the vascularized part of the cancer, you can use elastography. Interestingly, I know it doesn't sound like elastography, you can actually use elastography for both of those. And that's an investment that we've made to see that it was possible. So that's something really quite unique about TTP, is that technical depth and even sometimes built upon assets. Another example is I want to put a needle into this thing and inject something. Well, we've got a instrumented needle, which has got a very simple, low-cost manufacturing method of telling what it's touching. And it's just a pragmatic technical solution to what a lot of people want to solve. So things like that are technical depth. In terms of I asked one client to make an introduction to his colleagues because we don't do much marketing. This is kind of an adventure for me, this podcast with you. This feels like marketing. Yeah. But normally we just go and talk to our clients, my projects. That's kind of business development approach we take. But I asked one of our clients to introduce us to his colleagues, and he said, okay, sure. He said, this is a $2-3 billion a year company. And he said to his colleagues, so TTP did for us in 5 months what would have taken us 2 years internally. And they've got good resources, but we're fast. So we've got, in that case, it was enabled by microfabrication, our MEMS facility in-house, which is able to make an optical sensor to go inside of a organ, basically. And we could do that, turn that around in 5 months. And yeah, it's true. It would take a good med tech company about 2 years to do that. So speed is another thing. And then organizational agility. One of the really interesting things that we're facing as a company is the economics, the post-COVID economics situation, and frankly, the aging demographic economics. So in applications like eye care and applications like orthopedics, there's a huge financial squeeze on the market. So the profitability of companies in those sectors is really challenging right now. And they're doing everything right, but there's just a lot of pressure from insurers to postpone surgeries, to kick it down the road to another insurer. There's a lot of pressure to save on money. They didn't have the elective procedure, so they're short on revenues. And things like that are putting a lot of pressure on short-term profit and hence R&D spend. But there's a very clear, compelling case that they're just shoring up future revenues. So in orthopedics, there's a lot of elderly people playing pickleball, of all things, and they will need surgical interventions in order to be mobile. It's just that alone. My friend is literally the CFO of Medicaid, and he said to me, "You wouldn't believe it, Paul, but that is the number 2 factor behind COVID and the economics of the healthcare system right now is pickleball." I said, "Really?" So it's just a stupid example, but basically in orthopedics, in eye care, the world is getting older and eye problems are getting earlier. So you have increasing amounts of surgeries needed in the future. So those are driving future revenues. So that's driving an economic push to spend future balance sheet dollars instead of today's profit. So if you then translate that into R&D terms, it's meaning there's a lot of pressure not to have such a high percentage of your revenue spent on R&D, and that means actually can we find vehicles, economic vehicles, financial vehicles to put our R&D projects into, and that is putting a lot of emphasis on private equity funded projects. So that's been a really big trend for us, is to look at that impact of taking our projects, big TTP's projects, you know, £1-2 million projects, sometimes a bit bigger, sometimes a bit smaller, but you know what I mean. But at the upper end of that, it's putting a lot of strain on clients. So if you're talking about a 10 million, 20 million pound project to develop a new robot, to take that off of the P&L and put it onto a balance sheet is something where actually TTP is quite good at that. So we can set up a devco, and we can end up with a separate, entirely contained vehicle which can be acquired at the end of the process at 510K, for example. So that's something which is quite unique about TTP and something which is driving a lot of conversations. It's maybe not the most exciting thing in the world. It's sort of economics and finances and business, but it's still driving a lot of our work.
Yeah, but it's also pragmatic. It's pragmatic. It's not necessarily that it's the most exciting technology that's been developed out there talking about the economic side, but it is one of the biggest factors that actually drives the success or failure of these projects. Is they run out of cash and they run out of money. So if you can de-risk it and get them to market without having to get into commercialization and market or exit, but without actually having to spend the dollars and take that risk and get VC money, which is harder and harder to come by, it's a very valuable proposition to companies, especially if you're a founder who's great at developing tech and you're really great at building a company. Sometimes it's not the case. So yeah, it's interesting. What I really liked about you guys when I first met Ethan over in the offices was that you just decided, right, where is surgical robotics going? It's going to endoluminal. And so instead of going, let's go and find some projects here, you actually just, hey, let's build an endoluminal robot. So can you, how do you decide to do that? And what projects, how do you decide a project like that to take on? Why, I guess?
Oh, good question. That's one of the hardest questions here internally, is what do you invest your Friday afternoons in? We actually have a distinct push to build assets and capabilities and knowledge which may enable conversations we couldn't have had otherwise, and actually, frankly, sometimes even enables license revenues. So, for example, in surgical navigation, we've got a really exciting technology that's in the hands of a very dynamic client, and that's generating engineering revenues for us and also license revenues. But to find those, to pick the endoluminal robot, is really hard. So ultimately, what drove us to invest in endoluminal robotics was simply hearing so many people in the market, from clinicians saying, you know, from surgeons saying, I want to be able to do this inside the organ at conferences, to, you know, keynote speakers, down to people that we just talked to, our KOL pool. We have a clinician network, and they're telling us things like this, through to investors. So at JP Morgan in 2020, there was an awful lot of talk about investing in endoluminal robotics. Everybody was talking about it. So there was this classic, can't remember who gave the presentation. One of the keynote speeches at JP Morgan in 2020 was talking about the exponential growth forecast for that segment. And so we just thought, well, what can we do to get into that sector to create to make ourselves more useful? So ultimately, we're trying to make ourselves more valuable, more useful, trying to move the industry along. And if we can fast forward through some of the figuring out phases of endoluminal robotics, like for example, not just technical figuring out, things like also which procedures need to be looked at, what features of one procedure can be used in another. Is urology able to have some of the same features as ERCP, for example? Really, really interesting question. So we just looked at that, spoke to clinicians. We built up some prototypes. We also just literally thought, well, what are the key challenges? So, for example, in the colon, you need a very stable, mechanically stable system, which is able to generate traction forces and maybe counter traction forces. There's a debate, and it depends on the procedure. And maybe you need triangulation. And again, we invested a bit of time to look at who needs what, and then built some systems. If you're going to have a camera, what latency should it have? That's the kind of, and does that drive you to an FPGA solution? Well, we built one. We've got an FPGA-based camera backbone, which we can deploy for and we have deployed now for projects. So just things like that. We're just seeing signs in the market from investors. We're hearing clinicians talk about it. There's this whole debate. This is a whole really fun debate. Normally in endoluminal robotics, one of the first questions you debate is the customer going to be the surgeon or the endoscopist? And then some clever person says, oh, they're merging, and it's not quite the right question, and you should look at it a different way. But we were wading through all those debates in 2020, basically, just as the pandemic was hitting. Oh, my God. So we had this impossible project, this internal project done right during lockdown. So TTP had just sort of crucified its staff by doing this impossible ventilator challenge, which went well, but was very sort of traumatic for the people involved. And very much on the right in the back of that, we started turning a very significant effort into endoluminal robotics. People working from home on a robot. So, for example, we thought we'd try one of these crawler mechanisms where it can crawl along the lumen. And yeah, we could see that it was possible, but we could see it's going to be too slow. And that was done from home of one of our engineers. So yeah, that's the kind of background to why and how we did. So yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, Paul, so it's been a fascinating episode for me so far. So just want to give you an opportunity to make any closing comments. Is there anything you want the audience to know about you, your work, or anything that you want to say at all?
Oh, goodness. I mean, speaking very personally, my career goal is to make myself useful. If it's to my colleagues at work who need to know where to find something or to review a contract, I'll make myself useful. If it's to you, Henry, to find an organization that needs good recruits, let me try to refer you. If it's to medtech companies out there who are looking for help to get their dream realized, okay, we have a vested interest there, but I'd love to help. And also just to the surgeons out there who are just looking for advice. I just want to make myself useful. So that's all I'd have to say to your questions. That's my goal.
Be useful. Well, Paul, it's been a pleasure to host you on the Surgibots podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
Oh, thanks very much, Henry. You're a terrific interview, and I hope this is of some use to someone.
I think it is. Thank you very much.